G'day YouTube, Warbles not a lot here. Those of you who pay much attention to dates and calendars and anniversaries will be aware that we are coming up on the 79th anniversary of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Those of you who've been paying attention to my channel for a while may remember that a couple of months ago I posted two videos, both taken from this book, written by Jack Riddell, RAAF Catalina flight engineer to the founding commanding officer of 20 Squadron, a Flight Lieutenant Frank Chapman. Their aircraft was A-24-6. Jack Riddell was discharged June 1946. He had accumulated 2,300 flying hours. He participated in 32 bombing attacks during 120 operational flights. And among other things, the book contains Coral Sea Battle 1942 unit history sheet, details of operations, the Operations Records book, RAAF Station Port Moresby, number 11 and 20 squadrons. It's correct and amended from logbooks of pilots and crews by J. Riddell as at the 24th of the 7th, 1987. Revision number 3 on the 7th of December 89, Frank Chapman's log sheets located. Bracket Murray Brown advises that Dick Atkinson, Terry Dugan and Murray Brown replaced pilots and navigators. Otherwise, the previous crew remained on board. And on the 25th of the 11th, 1990, amend crew names for A2419 and A2423. So, quoting from page 11, the 1st of May 1942 was the day that the Coral Sea Battle commenced for the RAAF. Operations over the next 8 days would cost the lives of 2 crews, the loss of 3 aircraft, and 2 others needing repairs. Following pages contain lists of each aircraft and details the duty of each Catalina for their daily operations. Beginning on the 29th of April 1942, with 3 missions, flights, operations by 3 aircraft. We also have side-by-side Coral Sea Battle and a reappraisal after the Coral Sea Battle. I propose to read Coral Sea Battle to camera now, just as a sort of a heads-up pre-briefing orientation for those who are not familiar with it. So here we go. What you're looking at is a map of the actual Battle of the Coral Sea, the engagement between Americans and the Japanese. Although this story is about Catalinas, a very short description of the Coral Sea battle between the Japanese and American naval forces follows. After A-24-17, with Captain Bill Miller, located the Japanese task force of 5 vessels bound for Tulagi and Guadalcanal on May 1942, pointing there at Tulagi, the little tiny dot to the north of the island of Guadalcanal. He was not allowed to bomb without permission, even though the enemy opened with ack-ack fire against them. Aircraft A-24-14 with Captain Bob Hurst, who replaced Bill Miller during the night of the 1st of May and subsequently bombed 2 vessels without success on the morning of 2nd of May, was the first action in the Coral Sea battle against the Japanese. First shot fired by the RAAF, or bomb dropped. First shot was fired by the Japanese the day before, when the RAAF were not permitted to bomb. The American forces, consisting of carriers Lexington and Yorktown with cruisers and destroyers, were ready for battle by the 1st of May, but were still quite distant from the Tulagi area. But by May the 4th, Admiral Fletcher dispatched carrier planes from Yorktown to attack the Japanese forces who had landed on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, and they sunk a Japanese destroyer and damaged other shipping, but post-war information revealed that only 10 Japanese were killed. Admiral Fletcher regrouped, and on the 7th of May, his carrier planes found the Japanese carrier Shoho, which they sank with most of the crew and her aircraft. At the same time, Japanese carrier planes had found the American fleet oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims, and proceeded to attack, mistaking the Neosho for a carrier. These two vessels had been sent to the south by the Americans to keep them away from the fleet. Sims was sunk and Neosho was so damaged that it became partly submerged, and after it was found on the 11th of May and all survivors collected, destroyer Henley sunk the wreck. A supporting group of cruisers and destroyers under the command of the Australian Admiral Crace, comprising Australia, Hobart and Chicago, was dispatched to guard the southern extremity of the Jombard Passage, should the enemy break through on their way to Port Moresby. Admiral Crace was in a very dangerous area, and he was attacked by Japanese torpedo-carrying planes, but escaped damage and shot down 5 of his attackers. Crace's next problem came from high-level bombing by some 19 heavy bombers, which were American planes based in Australia. Thank you, Uncle Spam. The next day, 8th of May, the battle was joined again, and American carrier Lexington was mortally damaged, and after rescuing the crew's destroyers sank her. At the same time, the carrier Yorktown was also damaged, but after the action raced back to Pearl Harbor and quickly repaired. Meantime, the Japanese carrier Shokaku was so badly damaged by the Americans that the Japanese dispatched her back to Japan for repairs, and she was still under repair when the war finished. This was to deny the Japanese the use of this carrier in the next naval battle at Midway on the 4th of June, when the Japanese lost all 4 of their carriers and the Americans only lost the carrier Yorktown. A chart, which you're looking at, showing details of fleet movements on the Coral Sea battle is reproduced. The outcome of the Coral Sea battle was to force the Japanese action against Port Moresby to be made overland, and it also delayed their action through the Solomon Islands. It's a fact that's little appreciated by many people who have a cursory familiarity with the details of the Second World War. But after the Japanese had moved into French Indochina, and then they'd come down through Malaya and Singapore and moved into the Dutch East Indies, as it was called then, and they'd attacked the Philippines and basically come down through here like a hot knife through butter. Pretty much everybody in Australia was aware that Darwin was undefended. It was undefended because ever since the Japanese moved into French Indochina, way up there, the Australians had decided that we could not possibly defend all this and all of that against the Japanese. So we had a cunning plan where we put a line between Brisbane and Melbourne, and Australia was going to be abandoned to the Japanese on the northwest side of that line. And that little bit there, that's what Australia was going to defend, the Brisbane to Melbourne line. And down here at a place called Tokemwall, they were busily building and fortifying and entrenching a major airbase with which to repair all the aircraft which were expected to be damaged, fighting along the Brisbane to Melbourne line, defending Australia from the Japanese, who were honestly expected to come and land here at Darwin, and then with their tankettes and their bicycle brigades, they were going to come down to Alice Springs and basically take over the whole country. That's what Australia was afraid of. Known to the British and known to the Americans because of the Americans' mastery of the Japanese secret naval codes, the Japanese had other ideas entirely. What they wanted was a Japanese Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere, which had straight-line rectilinear boundaries. And their boundary was going to go from Timor, another reinforcement base on Ambon. They wanted Port Moresby, and they wanted Guadalcanal. Then the idea was to progress north. They wanted Wake Island. They were going to have a crack at Midway, but that didn't actually eventuate. And then more or less straight up to the Aleutian Islands, and then turn left or west again, straight across to Russia, and then down the Russian coast until they come to China and Burma and the Indian border. It was pretty close to being a rectangle, greater co-prosperity sphere with rectilinear borders, and that wasn't actually the silliest thing they did, in the sense that the sun moves 15 degrees across the surface of the Earth, or the terminator line, per hour. And Tokyo's pretty much up along there somewhere. So when it's 7 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, for the Japanese who were on Wake Island, or the Japanese who were on Guadalcanal, they were getting up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to salute the sun at Tokyo at 7 a.m. because the entire Japanese empire ran on flat Earth time, from Guadalcanal and Wake all the way across to the Indian Burma on the western side, or the Indian Burma on the Indian border on the western side of Burma. That's a bit of a segue, forgive me. Moving on to the details of operations, the operations record book and the unit history sheet. We begin with a flight made by A2422, stationed at Port Moresby, with a repositioning flight from Cairns to Rathmines, a distance of 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,100 miles, straight line, but you're not going to do that in a flying boat with no wheels, are you? So let's say 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200 miles. Hardly credit that you'd only add an extra 100 miles to the trip by doing a dog leg like that, but such is the case. A flight by Catalina A2422 of number 11 Squadron, Captain Pilot Officer N.V. Robertson, Second Pilot Pilot Officer W.G. Clark, from Cairns to Rathmines for engine overhaul. The aircraft was airborne, 17:25 hours, and waterborne, that's local time, waterborne at Rathmines 07:20 local. There were nil sightings, flying time 13 hours and 55 minutes overnight. So we have A2414 out of the advanced operating base at Tulagi, which is that little tiny dot just off the coast of Guadalcanal. So coming out of Tulagi, okay, now this has not been particularly easy to decipher. A reconnaissance by Catalina aircraft A2414, Captain Flying Officer R.M. Hurst, Second Pilot Pilot Officer A.C. Fleming, and Catalina aircraft A2424, Captain Flying Officer R.M. Seymour, Second Pilot Sergeant J.B.C. Bramall, of an area bound by lines joining the following positions: 11 degrees 20 minutes south, 160 degrees 30 minutes east, which is there, Rennell Island. And what I've got in the book is 159 degrees 30 minutes south, which is a nonsensical designation. You can't go 159 degrees south. You can go 90 degrees, but no more. So I'm going to say the 9 is a typographical error, and it should be 15 degrees 30 minutes south, 154 degrees east. And that would put us down here. So what we have is one aircraft taking off from Tulagi, flying straight down the meridian to Rennell Island, and then coming across to the middle of the Coral Sea and going back. And we have another aircraft taking off from Port Moresby. That's A2424 was, where are we? A2414 was airborne at Tulagi, 05:17 hours local, and waterborne at Moresby on 17 32 hours local time. So he's come down here, down there, back up to there, flown at dogleg course. A2414 was airborne to Largi by 0517 local and waterborne Moresby at 1732 local. A244 was airborne at 0626 whilst taking off, damaged its hull but carried out some reconnaissance, returning to Bowen for repairs, being waterborne at 1600 local. There were no sightings. The average visibility was 15 miles and cloud cover was 3/10. Flying time for A2414 was 12 hours 16 minutes. A2424 was 9 hours 34 minutes. And Bowen, which is where A2424 finished up, is there on the Queensland coast. So we've had one aircraft take off from Cairns and fly down to Rathmines. We have had another aircraft take off from Tulagi, fly down to Rennell Island, and then fly out here into the middle of the Coral Sea, and then go back to Moresby. We've had a different aircraft take off, damage itself on a log, fly out here, and then come back down to Bowen. So that's what the RAAF Catalinas, 3 of them, did 79 years ago today, in air quotes, because I'm videoing this on the 28th, not the 29th. But it will be posted on the 29th. 79 years after the event. And as you may have guessed, the plan is to post a video every day on the updates of what's happening in the Coral Sea 79 years ago, as recounted in the unit history sheet and operations record book. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. The good old days of slide rules, eh? Back in the days when getting a flat battery on your flight plan computer was not the sort of thing that anybody ever used to worry about. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Back tomorrow with more to tell. Ciao.